She had been waiting for this night for years, but the anticipation felt different now. It wasn't just another performance or another event. Tonight, she would be playing in a room filled with people who didn't know her story. People who only saw her as someone hired to fill the background with soft music. That's how it was supposed to be. That's what she had been told. Play simple, they said. Nothing too loud, nothing too complicated. Just background notes that no one would really notice. The words had stung a little when she first heard them, even though she tried not to let it show. She had played for audiences before, but this was different. This was her chance to be seen, even if in the smallest way. And yet, she was being asked to shrink herself into something small, almost invisible. She arrived early at the grand hall, carrying only a small bag with sheet music and her piano shoes. The hall was a large, echoing space with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, sparkling like stars. Everything smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive flowers. She paused for a moment, taking it all in. The people who would soon fill the room were busy setting up, talking in hurried tones, checking their watches and phones. She felt out of place, like she didn't belong here at all, but she reminded herself why she was there. She reminded herself that music had always been her refuge, her voice, and sometimes her rebellion. When she walked over to the piano, she ran her fingers lightly over the keys. They felt cold under her touch, but familiar. The piano was grand, black and shiny, with ivory keys that seemed to glow in the soft lights. She remembered her first piano at home, a small upright that had belonged to her grandmother. She remembered the long afternoons spent learning, failing, and trying again. Music had been her companion in loneliness, her way of understanding the world. Tonight, she would share that feeling, even if she was only allowed to play simple. A man in a suit approached her just as she was placing her bag beside the piano bench. "We're counting on you to keep it simple," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Nothing too complicated. It's background music for the gala. Just soft and easy." He didn't smile. He didn't know what she was capable of. He only knew that she was a musician, hired for a job, and that the instructions were clear. She nodded. "Of course," she said quietly. But inside, her mind began to wander. Play simple. Did he really understand what that meant? Could she play simple without losing herself? She had learned over the years that simple did not mean meaningless. Simple could be powerful. Simple could be beautiful. And sometimes simple could be unforgettable. She began to set up her sheet music. Glancing around the room, as the first guests started to arrive, everyone seemed to be in a rush, adjusting their outfits, checking their phones, talking in small groups. Some laughed softly. Some nodded to each other as if they were part of a secret world she didn't belong to. She noticed the little details that others overlooked: the nervous fingers of a young woman adjusting her necklace, the hesitant smile of a man who seemed unsure where to stand. Music was about observation too, she thought. Music was about noticing the subtleties. And tonight, she would play for more than just the grand room. She would play for those quiet moments, for the hidden feelings. When the first few notes escaped the piano, she felt a small thrill run through her. The sound was soft and delicate, almost shy, but it carried a weight she couldn't hide. She could see the guests looking in her direction, some out of curiosity, some barely noticing. That was fine. She didn't need anyone to notice her fully. Not yet. She only needed to remember who she was. Each note reminded her of the long hours she had spent practicing alone, the nights when she had cried over mistakes, the mornings when her fingers hurt but she refused to stop. This was her language, her truth. Even simple music could speak volumes if played honestly. As she continued, she noticed a few people stopping their conversations. They glanced toward her, tilting their heads slightly, listening just a little longer than they expected. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Perhaps she thought they were starting to feel it, the emotion that didn't need words. The story she was telling without even realizing it. Music had always been like that. It had a way of finding people even when they didn't want to be found, even when they were too busy to listen. And tonight, it would find them anyway. Her mind drifted to memories of her teachers, people who had seen potential in her long before anyone else did. They had pushed her, sometimes too harshly, but always with belief. They had taught her that music was more than notes. Music was breathing. Music was life. She could feel it in her chest now, a rhythm that wasn't written on any sheet of paper. She pressed her hands harder on some keys, lighter on others, letting her instincts guide her. She wasn't breaking the rules of simple, but she was breathing life into them. And the difference was already noticeable. Time seemed to stretch in the room. The chandeliers glimmered, the guests moved like shadows, but she remained in her own bubble of sound. She felt the piano respond beneath her fingers, a loyal friend that never judged. Each note connected to the next, and each pause carried meaning. She realized she had forgotten about the instructions to play simple, at least in the rigid sense. The music was becoming hers, as it always had, and in that moment she understood something important. Playing simple didn't mean hiding her soul. It meant showing it with clarity, without unnecessary embellishments. A few people approached the piano, curious. One older gentleman with a kind face nodded in approval. A woman holding a glass of champagne stopped for a moment, her eyes widening slightly. The music was soft, but it had substance, depth, a quiet power that made people stop noticing themselves for a second. She caught a glimpse of the man who had told her to play simple earlier. He frowned slightly, confused, as if he couldn't place why the music felt different from what he had expected. She smiled faintly, but kept her eyes on the keys. She didn't need to explain. Music would explain itself. As the evening went on, she continued to play, letting the simple melody flow naturally. She experimented subtly, adding small variations here and there, feeling the reaction in the room. Some people didn't notice at all, but that didn't matter. Others leaned in closer, unconsciously drawn to the sound. Music had a way of reaching people even when they resisted it. And tonight, she was determined to reach them, to let them feel what she felt every time she sat at a piano. She remembered the nights when she had played alone. In a small room, with only the moonlight for company, she had poured her fears, hopes, and dreams into the keys, and somehow the piano had held them all. Tonight, the grand hall, the chandeliers, the people in fancy clothes, they didn't matter as much as that connection. She was not performing for approval. She was performing to be present, to be alive, to be real. And that, she realized, was the essence of simple music. It wasn't simple because it was easy. It was simple because it was honest. By the time the first hour of the gala passed, she felt herself settling into a rhythm. She was no longer nervous. She was aware of the room, aware of the people, but she was more aware of herself and her music. Every note had intention. Every pause had meaning. She could feel the subtle shifts in the atmosphere as the audience began to notice something beyond background noise. She was creating a space for them without forcing them to leave theirs. A gentle bridge built with sound. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting a familiar melody take over. The music was hers, but it was also theirs now. It carried warmth, sadness, joy, and hope all at once. She realized that playing simple did not mean limiting her emotions. It meant finding the core of feeling and sharing it plainly. And she had learned long ago that the simplest expressions often carried the most truth. By the end of the evening's first set, she could sense the shift. The simple music that had been requested was no longer just background. It had a presence. It had weight. It had life. And though no one had said it yet, she felt them listening differently now. The night was young, and the gala would continue. But she knew one thing with certainty. Something had changed. And it had started with her decision to play honestly, fully, and without hiding. She leaned back slightly, her hands resting lightly on the keys, taking a moment to breathe. The room was quiet, more so than before. The guests were engaged in hushed conversations, but now with a new attentiveness. Something unspoken had passed between them and her music. She smiled softly, thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, the simple request to play simple had given her the perfect chance to remind everyone that simplicity, honesty, and truth could create moments that no one would forget. She continued playing, her fingers moving almost automatically across the keys. The music felt alive under her touch, like it had a heartbeat of its own. She could sense the room's energy shifting, though subtly at first. Some guests were still murmuring softly, checking their watches, adjusting their clothes. Others, she noticed, had stopped mid-conversation, heads tilted slightly, eyes narrowing as they tried to place the feeling the music brought to them. She didn't need to see them clearly. She could feel it. Music had a way of telling her more than words ever could. The instructions had been simple. Keep it simple. Just background music. But her heart wouldn't allow her to stop at mere simplicity. She had learned long ago that music was never just notes. It was feeling, memory, and emotion wrapped together. Each chord she played carried a part of her story, though no one in the room could guess it yet. She thought of the nights she had spent alone, teaching herself subtle variations and small expressions that could make a simple melody sound alive. Those nights had been quiet, but they had shaped her. And now, in a room full of strangers in fancy clothes, she realized that those quiet nights were her strength at first. She worried that the change in her playing might be too noticeable. What if someone complained? What if they felt she had ignored their instructions? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that following instructions blindly was not what music was about. Music was about honesty. And tonight, she wanted the music to be honest. She wanted it to speak for her in a way that words never could. Slowly, she began to add small variations to the simple melody. She played a few notes slightly longer, lingered on a pause a fraction of a second more than written. Let a chord swell gently before fading. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who didn't listen closely. But to someone who was paying attention, it was impossible to ignore. She noticed a few people leaning closer to the piano, their conversations fading into silence. Their expressions were hard to read at first, but there was a flicker of curiosity, a spark that told her they were feeling something. She remembered her teacher's advice from years ago: never play for approval, play for truth. That advice had saved her more times than she could count. There were moments in her life when she felt small, invisible, and doubted herself. And every time, music reminded her that she could express things without needing anyone's permission. Now, in this glittering hall, surrounded by people who expected nothing more than quiet, forgettable background music, she felt that same strength rising. She could give them something more. Something real. The room was large, and at first, the sound of the piano felt lost among the chandeliers, the laughter, and the clinking of glasses. But slowly she noticed the changes. A group of women by the back wall had stopped talking, heads slightly tilted as if listening to a story they didn't expect to hear. A man near the entrance had paused mid-step, frozen for a second before continuing to move, his eyes lingering on her hands. Small moments, but they mattered. Music had always been about small moments. A note held a thought. A pause held a feeling. Silence held possibility. And tonight, each of those moments was building. She allowed herself to breathe into the music. Each breath guided her fingers as much as her memory or training. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was telling a story she didn't have words for. She thought of the difficult days when she had been told she wasn't good enough, when her efforts had gone unnoticed, when she had almost given up. The piano had been there for her through it all, waiting silently, patient and unjudging. Now it responded in kind, carrying her courage into the room in soft, fluid waves. Some guests began to notice more clearly. One woman paused in front of the piano, setting her glass down on a nearby table, her eyes wide with something close to wonder. She didn't move for several moments, standing still as if afraid to break the spell. A few others quietly followed suit, slowly gathering near the edges of the room without saying a word. They weren't supposed to watch so closely, not supposed to be captivated by background music, but they couldn't help themselves. Something about the sound made the space feel different. It made them feel something they weren't expecting. She wasn't trying to impress them. She wasn't performing for applause or praise. She was performing for the music itself, letting it flow through her and out into the room. And that honesty carried a quiet power. The man who had given her the instructions to play, Simple, wandered closer, frowning slightly, trying to understand why the music felt different from what he had envisioned. He was polite, careful, trying not to interrupt, but his curiosity betrayed him. Something was happening here that he hadn't anticipated. Her hands moved faster now, though not recklessly. She played with intention, with nuance, letting her emotions guide the tempo and dynamics. The simple melody that had started the evening was transforming slowly, almost imperceptibly, into something more expressive. She didn't need anyone to notice every detail. Music had a way of reaching people without their permission. She had learned that the hard way. And tonight, she let it happen naturally. Time passed unnoticed. The gala continued around her, the conversations, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. But she was lost in her own world, a world built of sound, memory, and feeling. She remembered the first piece she had ever learned, a simple tune that had brought her both frustration and joy. She remembered her mother humming along to it, her father nodding in quiet approval. And the nights when she had played in secret just to hear the sound of her own progress. Those memories infused each note with warmth and familiarity. The music wasn't just notes. It was history, emotion, and life. Occasionally, someone would glance at her hands and whisper to a neighbor. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She could feel the change in the air, the attention that was shifting subtly. People were starting to notice the depth in something that had been meant to be shallow. She smiled faintly to herself. That was the power of simple music done with intention. It could surprise, move, and even transform a room if it was played honestly. Her eyes swept the room occasionally, catching glimpses of faces she didn't know, faces that were slowly letting down their guard. One young woman seemed particularly moved, pressing a hand gently against her chest, her lips parting slightly as if trying to hold back words. A man near the center, who had been tapping his foot impatiently, now leaned back, his expression thoughtful, almost reflective. These small changes were proof that music didn't need to be loud or complicated to matter. It only needed truth. The evening stretched on. She kept the music flowing, maintaining the simple melody, but allowing it to breathe and expand naturally. She added gentle rises and falls, small inflections that carried emotion. It wasn't flashy, but it was alive. She noticed the reactions around her, the subtle nods, the brief pauses in conversation, the quiet smiles. It was enough. She didn't need applause to know that the music was reaching people. She could feel it. And that feeling was enough to keep her moving, keep her playing. Occasionally, she caught someone's eye, not in a confrontational way, but in a way that connected them to the music. Some looked away quickly, unsure of what they were feeling. Others lingered, drawn in without fully understanding why. That was the strange power of music, the way it could bypass thought and reach straight to the heart. She had felt it herself countless times, and now she was giving it to them. She thought of the man who had given her the instructions earlier. He still stood near the back, frowning slightly, trying to understand why simple music sounded so much more alive than he had expected. She didn't try to explain. She didn't need to. Music was its own explanation. He might not understand it fully, but he could feel it, whether he admitted it or not. That was enough. As the first half of the evening passed, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She had been hired for a job, told to play simple, and yet she had turned it into something more. Not for recognition, not for praise, but because it was the only way she could play honestly. Music had always been her voice, and tonight it was speaking louder than anyone could have anticipated. She felt a quiet satisfaction, sense of purpose, that went beyond the event or the audience. The guests continued to mingle, but now there was a subtle difference. People seemed more attentive, more present, more aware. She had created a shift without anyone realizing it. A soft but undeniable change had moved through the room, and she knew deep in her heart that this was only the beginning. Her hands danced over the keys, fluid and confident, drawing the music out in waves that carried emotion, memory, and subtle storytelling. She let the melody rise gently, then fall, creating a conversation with the room itself. She felt the energy of the space, the presence of the audience, the pulse of the evening, and let it guide her. She wasn't just playing notes anymore. She was creating a shared experience, something that each person would interpret in their own way, something that would stay with them long after the night ended. and in that moment she realized something important. Playing simple was not a limitation. It was a choice. It was a canvas on which she could paint honesty and feeling, subtle but powerful. She smiled to herself, letting the music carry her forward, knowing that she had already begun to surprise the people in the room. The night was far from over, but she had already changed something without anyone fully noticing yet. And that, she knew, was the quiet magic of music done with truth. She paused for a moment, letting her hands hover just above the keys. The simple melody that had begun the evening had carried her through the first part of the gala. But now she felt something shifting inside her. The music was no longer just background, it had become a living thread, weaving through the room, connecting people she didn't even know. She could sense it in the small changes, the quiet attention, the subtle leaning forward, the soft expressions of surprise and wonder. Something was stirring in the audience, though they didn't realize it yet. And she knew, deep down, that it was her choice to push this moment further. Her fingers descended on the keys again. This time she let the melody expand. Not wildly or recklessly, but carefully, thoughtfully. She added small flourishes, subtle dynamics, little pauses that stretched the tension just long enough to make a listener notice. It wasn't flashy, but it wasn't ordinary anymore either. The room, which had been buzzing with quiet conversations and polite laughter, began to settle into something more attentive. People stopped mid-sentence, unconsciously drawn to the sound. They couldn't explain it, but something in the music made them pause, made them listen. She thought of all the nights she had spent alone with the piano. The times when no one believed in her talent but she refused to stop practicing. The times she had played in empty rooms, letting the music carry all the frustration, the sadness, and the hope she had felt in her life. That quiet perseverance had led her here. She realized, as her hands moved over the keys, that those lonely nights had not been wasted. Each note she played now carried that history, even if no one in the hall could see it. Music, she had learned, could carry stories without words. And tonight, she was telling hers. Somewhere near the back, a few guests began to whisper softly, glancing at each other. Their eyes were wide, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. The music was still soft, still labeled as simple, but it had a presence now that was impossible to ignore. She noticed a couple of people pausing in their steps, turning to watch her play without even realizing they were doing it. It was subtle, almost invisible, but she could feel the energy shift. It was as if the room itself had taken a deep breath, leaning in to listen. She allowed herself a small smile as she noticed these reactions. They weren't applause or words of praise, but they were signs that her music was reaching people. She didn't need validation from anyone, but it was reassuring to feel that the effort she had poured into her playing was connecting with someone, even quietly. She thought about the man who had told her to play simple. He had no idea what she was capable of. He didn't know that simple could carry so much emotion, so much truth, and perhaps that was the point. Tonight, she would show without a word that simplicity didn't mean weakness or lack of skill. It could be powerful beyond expectation. Her fingers moved faster now, with confidence but without rushing. Each note was deliberate, each pause meaningful. She began to let her emotions guide the tempo subtly, allowing the music to rise and fall naturally, carrying tension and release in a gentle rhythm. It was no longer background. It was a quiet force, a presence that filled the space without demanding attention, yet impossible to ignore. She could feel the reactions in the room, the subtle shifts in posture, the soft intake of breath, the way people unconsciously stopped fidgeting. Her music was telling them something they hadn't expected to feel. She thought about the stories hidden in the faces around her. A woman standing by the wall, adjusting her bracelet nervously, seemed to relax slightly, letting the music reach her. A man by the staircase leaned back, eyes closed, allowing himself to be carried by the sound. Even those who tried to keep their focus on conversation found themselves drawn back, like the music had a gravity of its own. She realized that this was the beauty of honesty in performance. It didn't matter if everyone noticed consciously. The impact existed, quietly, persistently, in ways that couldn't be measured. As the melody continued, she began to add small layers of harmony. subtle enough that only someone listening closely could detect the depth. It was a careful balance, enhancing the simplicity without overwhelming it. She knew this would surprise some people. She could already sense that a few were trying to figure out why something so simple could feel so complete, so full of life. She allowed the music to breathe, giving each note space to resonate, and she felt the room responding. Not in words, not yet, but in energy, in attention. In unspoken recognition, her mind drifted briefly to her childhood, to the first piano she had touched, to the small lessons learned through frustration and patience. She remembered being told that her playing wasn't good enough, that she should stick to simple tunes that she might never be noticed. Yet here she was, turning simple instructions into something that commanded attention without force. She felt a surge of quiet pride, tempered with humility. This wasn't about showing off. It was about being true to herself and letting the music do the rest. She noticed a few children near the edge of the room, peeking around their parents to see her hands on the keys. They weren't supposed to be paying attention. They were meant to be quiet, polite, waiting for the gala to pass, but they were mesmerized. She smiled softly, knowing that children were often the most honest audience. They felt the music without judgment, without expectation, and her melody seemed to reach them instantly. It reminded her of her younger self, listening to music in wonder, unaware of the world's limitations. The man who had given her instructions earlier was watching more closely now. His frown had softened into something resembling curiosity. He wasn't sure what to make of it. He had expected background music, forgettable and polite, but what he heard was alive, tensional, and somehow more than the sum of its notes. He tried to mask his surprise, but she could feel it in the small shift of his posture, the way his gaze lingered. He might not understand it fully, but he could feel it. And that was already significant. She allowed herself to take bigger risks now. She added small, unexpected turns in the melody, gentle flourishes that felt natural but that drew the ear. It was still simple, but it was no longer predictable. People began to notice, unconsciously moving their attention toward the piano. A hush seemed to fall over part of the room, not complete silence, but a collective pause in the background noise. The music had begun to shape the atmosphere, creating space for reflection, for feeling, for attention that hadn't been there before. Her heart beat in time with the music, a quiet synchronization that made her playing feel effortless. She could feel her connection with the piano deepening, as if they were speaking together without words. Each note was a sentence, each chord a paragraph, each pause a comma. The room was no longer just a gaylet, was a shared space, a moment suspended in time, created by sound and presence. She realized then that this was what she had always hoped for in music, the ability to reach people, to connect. To communicate without needing explanation. The audience responded in small, meaningful ways. Some unconsciously leaned closer, others tilted their heads, listening with a quiet intensity. A few exchanged glances, surprised at how a simple melody could carry so much depth. She noticed one older woman pressing a hand to her chest, eyes glistening slightly, clearly moved by something she couldn't name. These small, almost invisible reactions told her more than applause ever could. The music had already reached them. It had already touched them. As the night progressed, she continued to explore the melody. She experimented subtly with rhythm and phrasing, keeping the core simple, but adding nuance and texture. She watched the room shift, feeling the energy become more focused, more alive, more engaged. Even those who had tried to ignore the music were now drawn in. She realized that this was the point. Music that was honest, simple, and heartfelt had a quiet power that could not be contained or ignored. She thought of all the times she had been underestimated, told to stay in the background, to avoid taking risks. She smiled to herself. Tonight those rules didn't apply. She was not performing for permission or approval. She was performing because she could, because she needed to, because the music demanded it. And in that decision, she found freedom. Freedom not just in her playing, but in her presence. In the way she occupied the space, a subtle tension began to build in the room. Not a negative tension, but a sense of anticipation. As if everyone unconsciously realized that something extraordinary was unfolding. The music was simple, yes, but it was no longer ordinary. She felt the weight of that realization, but she welcomed it. She was ready. She had been ready all along. The room, the audience, the piano itself, they were all part of a moment she had created, quietly, honestly, without expectation. Her fingers moved faster, yet delicately, letting the melody grow organically. The music began to tell a fuller story now, one that no one could have predicted. It was a story of hope, of persistence, of quiet courage. And as she played, she could feel it rippling through the audience, reaching people in ways she hadn't imagined. Faces softened, eyes brightened, postures shifted. The music was speaking, and for the first time that evening, she could feel that they were truly listening. And in that moment, she knew something important. The instructions to play simple had not limited her at all. They had given her the perfect starting point to show that honesty. Intention and courage could transform the simplest melody into something unforgettable. She smiled to herself, letting the music carry her forward, knowing that the evening was far from over, but that a shift had already occurred, a shift she had quietly orchestrated. Note by note, heart by heart, the music had changed the room completely now. What had begun as background noise had become something far more significant. People were no longer talking or checking their phones. Even the conversations that had been polite and idle now faded into soft murmurs. Guests were standing or leaning subtly, almost unconsciously, drawn toward the sound that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. The simple melody she had been asked to play had transformed, carrying a weight that no one had expected. She noticed small details she hadn't before. The way a woman near the center had tilted her head, her eyes glistening faintly. The man by the staircase, whose frown had remained unchanged for most of the evening, now looked thoughtful, almost reflective. Even the children who had been peeking from behind their parents seemed transfixed, their attention fully captured. These were quiet signs, subtle but undeniable, that her music was reaching people in ways far beyond what anyone had intended. She didn't stop playing. She let the melody swell gently, rising in emotion without ever becoming loud or overwhelming. Each note was deliberate, each pause carefully placed to give the listeners space to feel. She could sense their attention growing, their hearts opening, though not a word had been spoken. She had learned over the years that silence could be as powerful as sound, and she now relied on that understanding. Every small reaction, the faint smile, the soft intake of breath, slight nod was a signal that she was connecting with them. A quiet thrill ran through her. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when simple could become profound. She had been told to play simple, but the truth she carried in her music could not be hidden. She had practiced, struggled, and learned through years of solitude and perseverance. And now, all of it was reaching the room. It was not performance for the sake of applause. It was honesty, unfiltered. And that honesty had a presence that demanded attention. Her fingers moved effortlessly, guided by instinct and emotion. She began to add subtle harmonies, gentle flourishes that enhanced the simplicity without taking away from it. The music was growing richer, fuller, but still intimate. She noticed a woman standing by the back, her hand pressed lightly to her chest, eyes slightly moist. A man near the front, who had been casually observing, now leaned forward. His expression softened by something he couldn't quite name. The power of the music was quiet but undeniable. It was reaching them in ways that words never could. She allowed herself a brief glance around the room. Seeing the shifts in attention, the subtle changes in posture and expression, people were listening now. They were noticing. They were feeling. The gala, which had been about appearances, speeches, and polite entertainment, was no longer just that. It had become a shared experience, shaped by her hands, her heart, and her music. She realized that her performance had started to change the room, not through grand gestures or dramatic flourishes, but through sincerity and presence. Her mind drifted back to the lonely nights she had spent practicing, when the only audience was a small lamp, the quiet of an empty room, and her own reflection in the polished keys. Those nights had taught her patience, attention, and the subtle power of restraint. She had learned to listen deeply, to feel each note fully, and to express emotion without excess. Now, all of that experience was coming alive, reaching people who had never imagined that simple music could carry such depth. She noticed a subtle tension in the room, not nervousness. People were leaning in, unconsciously, as if expecting something more. She smiled faintly, realizing that the moment had shifted from background music to something unforgettable. She began to let the melody rise slightly, not in volume, but in emotional intensity. Each chord carried a story, each pause a question, each note a gentle nudge into feeling. The room seemed to breathe with her, responding to the ebb and flow of the music. A man who had been standing near the side, arms crossed and eyes skeptical, now lowered his gaze, clearly absorbed. A woman who had been quietly chatting paused mid-sentence, her expression softening. Even those who tried to remain polite and indifferent were subtly drawn into the unfolding moment. Music had a way of bypassing intellect, she thought. It spoke directly to the heart, and it didn't ask permission. It didn't require consent. It simply existed in its existence. It reached people who had been unsuspecting until now. Her hands glided over the keys, moving with precision and feeling. She allowed herself small improvisations, subtle shifts in tempo, gentle rises and falls, all while keeping the core melody intact. The music was no longer just sound. It was a conversation, a story, a living presence in the room. Guests responded without realizing they were responding, letting themselves be carried along by something simple yet extraordinary. She had taken a simple request and turned it into something deeply human. And it thrilled her to see the impact it was having. She thought of the man who had instructed her earlier to play simple. He was somewhere in the room, still observing, still trying to understand why the music felt different from what he had expected. She didn't care about his approval, but she noticed the small shift in his demeanor. Even he, with his polite skepticism, was being touched. That was proof enough that honesty in music could break through any expectation or imposition. Her fingers danced across the keys, moving faster now, yet always controlled. She added layers of emotion, letting the music breathe naturally. The room was quiet, but it was no longer still. There was a subtle hum of attention, a shared awareness that made the gala feel smaller, more intimate, despite the number of people present. She felt the connection, and it gave her courage. She was no longer just a background musician. She was shaping the room, guiding the emotions, creating a space where people could feel without knowing why. She noticed small reactions everywhere. A woman standing near the window had her hand over her heart, her eyes wide with surprise. A man by the chandelier had paused mid-step, leaning slightly toward the piano. Even the children who had been playing quietly with each other had stopped to watch. They were drawn in, captivated, by something that had started simply, but was now full of life. She smiled softly, letting the music carry her forward. Aware of the quiet magic she had created, time seemed to stretch as she played. She lost herself in the music, feeling every note, every pause, every gentle swell. She no longer thought about instructions or expectations. She thought only of the room, the people, and the story she was telling through her fingers. It was a story of quiet strength, of perseverance, of honesty, of beauty and simplicity. In the room, in its own subtle ways, responded. She noticed the older gentleman near the center, his eyes moist as he listened intently. The young woman who had been nervous at the beginning now stood straight, clearly affected by the sound. Even the man who had been skeptical and distant was leaning forward slightly, his expression softened. These small reactions filled her with a quiet satisfaction. Music had reached them, touched them, changed them without force or words. It had done exactly what she had hoped it would do. As the evening continued, she allowed herself to explore more deeply. She added small flourishes, subtle shifts in dynamics, gentle pauses that hung in the air for just a moment longer than expected. The music was alive, breathing, shaping the room without demanding attention. She felt the audience moving with her, even when they didn't realize it. They were listening, feeling, and responding in ways that were beyond conscious thought, and she felt a quiet joy in that realization. The gala, with all its glitter and elegance, had become a shared moment of emotion. She had taken a simple request and transformed it into something profound simply by being honest with her music. She could feel the difference. She could see it in the way people moved, the way they breathed, the way they unconsciously leaned in to hear more. Music had a way of speaking the truth that words often could not. And tonight, that truth was undeniable. Her hands moved with confidence now, her emotions guiding her fingers effortlessly. She added small variations that enhanced the melody without overpowering it. The audience leaned in collectively, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. They weren't sure what it was, but they could feel it, and that feeling was enough to hold them in place, to keep them listening, to make the room feel smaller, more connected, more alive. She glanced briefly at the man who had told her to play simple. His expression had softened, his skepticism replaced with something like wonder. She didn't smile at him. She didn't need to. The music had already done what words could not. It had reached him, touched him, changed the atmosphere in ways he hadn't anticipated, and that was enough. She allowed herself to take a few deeper breaths, letting the music flow naturally. Each chord, each note, each pause carried her story, her history, her perseverance, and her honesty. The audience responded without realizing it, letting themselves be moved, captivated, and affected. The simple instructions to play background music had been transformed into something unforgettable, simply by playing honestly, fully, and without compromise. As the night wore on, she noticed a profound stillness among some guests. The soft hum of conversation had faded almost entirely. People were standing, leaning, watching, listening, feeling. Even those who had initially tried to ignore the music could not help but be drawn in. Her hands moved effortlessly, the music carrying emotion without needing to shout. It had become something larger than herself, something shared, something unforgettable. And in that moment, she knew she had succeeded. She had taken a simple instruction and made it extraordinary. She had reached people in ways that words never could. She had created a moment of connection, beauty, and honesty that no one would forget. The gala had become more than an event. It had become a space of shared humanity, held together by the simplest, truest music she could offer. The final notes hung in the air, soft but full, as if reluctant to leave. She paused, her hands hovering briefly above the keys, feeling the resonance of every chord she had played. The room was quiet now, not with awkwardness, not with tension, but with a stillness that was almost reverent. People were frozen, caught in a moment they hadn't expected. Realizing that the music had been more than background, it had been a story, a conversation, a revelation, and she had told it with nothing more than simple notes, honesty and heart. She let the last chord fade slowly, pressing it gently and letting her fingers linger just long enough for the sound to reach every corner. The silence that followed was heavy, almost tangible, but it was not uncomfortable. It was full, complete, a shared pause that felt like everyone was exhaling together. She could feel the subtle shifts in posture, the soft intake of breath, the slight widening of eyes. They had been listening without fully knowing, and now they realized how much they had been touched. She had expected no applause, no immediate recognition, and yet the weight of the moment was undeniable. Some guests exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of surprise, awe, and something softer, almost tender. They had been expecting simple background music, polite and forgettable. Instead, they had received a performance that spoke of struggle, persistence, hope, and quiet strength. It wasn't flashy. There were no dramatic gestures, no unnecessary embellishments, but the honesty, the subtle depth, the lived experience in every note had reached them where words could not. And now they knew it. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the last vibrations in the piano echoing softly into the corners of the room. This was the culmination of years of practice, of patience, of quiet determination. Every lonely night, every moment when she had doubted herself, every time she had been told her talent was not enough, had all led to this moment. And now, the room itself seemed to recognize it, responding with a collective stillness that was more powerful than any applause could have been. A few people finally spoke. Quietly at first, unsure of whether to break the reverent hush, a soft murmur spread, gentle but noticeable. They were exchanging words of astonishment. Comments about how beautiful the music had been, how they had felt something profound without even understanding why. She smiled faintly to herself, keeping her hands poised lightly on the keys. She didn't need to hear more. She could feel it, the impact, the connection, the quiet transformation. The music had done its work. The man who had instructed her earlier to play simple approached slowly, his steps careful, almost hesitant. His expression had softened completely, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of surprise, perhaps even admiration. He opened his mouth as if to speak, paused, and then simply nodded toward her. It was not a grand gesture, but it carried more weight than words could convey. She nodded back lightly, her smile gentle but knowing. He understood, finally, that simple did not mean limited. Simple could be profound. Simple could be unforgettable. She took a small breath and allowed herself to relax. The performance was over, but the effect lingered. Guests who had been talking now remained quiet, hesitant to break the moment. Others were moving closer, still drawn to the piano, still absorbing the sound that seemed to linger in the air. Even those who had been skeptical, distracted, or disinterested were now engaged, caught in the quiet power of what had happened. She realized then that this was the true gift of music. It could touch people without demanding attention, without shouting, without forcing recognition. It simply reached them. As she rose from the bench, she glanced once more around the room. Faces reflected awe, reflection, even a quiet emotion that was hard to name. Some guests had tears in their eyes, while others simply stood quietly, processing the subtle power of what they had just experienced. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't need it. She had given them her honesty, her history, her emotions through sound, and they had received it fully. That was enough. That was more than enough. She stepped away from the piano slowly, her hands brushing the keys lightly one last time, as if saying goodbye to an old friend. The music was no longer hers alone. It had become a part of the room, a part of the people present, a shared experience that would linger long after the gala ended. She could feel the weight of it, quiet but undeniable. In her chest, a warm satisfaction spread, a mixture of relief, pride, and humility. She had taken something simple and transformed it into something extraordinary. Guests began to move again. Slowly, quietly, reluctant to break the magic of the moment. Some approached her cautiously, offering soft words of gratitude or praise. She responded with gentle smiles and nods, allowing the music to speak for her. She didn't need to explain anything. The performance had already told the story of perseverance, of honesty, of courage, and of beauty in simplicity. The recognition, if it came, was secondary. The music had already done its work. She thought of the children who had been peeking earlier. Some of them approached now, eyes wide, hesitant, almost in awe. She knelt slightly, giving them a small, reassuring smile, letting them know that music was for everyone, regardless of age or status. Their eyes sparkled with understanding, even without words. She'd always believed that the true power of music was in moments like these, quiet, unnoticed by the majority, but deeply meaningful to those who truly felt it. The older gentleman near the center of the room approached her as well, his expression soft and thoughtful. He didn't offer grand gestures or excessive praise, but his eyes reflected gratitude, recognition, and perhaps a little humility. He had come expecting simple background music, and instead, he had witnessed something extraordinary. The room, which had been a space of formality, had become alive with shared emotion, and he, like everyone else, had been caught in it.